Good evening. Welcome once again to the Bible Speaks Today from Latonia Baptist Church Television Ministries. If you're wondering about these when I'm sitting here, I've got my notes up on my little computer here. The monitor is 20 feet away across the other side of the studio. And so right now it's just a blur. So if I want to watch when the credits are coming up so I know when to start talking to you without getting yelled at by the camera team, then I have to have these on. And then I don't have to have them on, whatever. Couple of things before we get into program. First of all, just a gentle reminder that you can see this program on our website, latoniabaptist.org/video, and then when you get there, TV rather, sorry. Just been reminded it's TV, not video. And then you can pick the one you want. So if you've tuned in like last week or even this week and you think, what the heck's he talking about? Then you can go back and look at them, and they will stay on there for a while. I imagine at the end of the series, whenever that is going to be, and assuming that I can get the library to cooperate with me, if anyone did want the whole 9 yards on one DVD, which is not if it's possible, but we're looking at doing something like that down the road. The whole, 6 hours or whatever it is, probably more than that. Other than that, we'll see what else we can do. Maybe we can put it all on the YouTube in one foul swoop, and you can get it that way. Anyway, and we can drop out the intros and the farewells and the publicity stuff and just get to the meat of the program. We shall see. You can also see our sister program, the Sunshine Club, on the same website, as well as seeing it, of course, on cable television, as this one goes on cable television. I know a lot of people get satellite or Cincinnati Bell or and don't get this particular channel that this goes out on. But we're on channel 17 on TWC, Time Warner, I think it's still called, probably Comcast next year, and then whatever else we're going to be. Anyway, I digress, but that's where you can find us. And if anyone wants a particular copy of a particular program, probably not these because they all run together, but if you see something on the website that you like, then drop me a line and we'll see what we can do for you. Okay, back to where we were. If you remember last week, still talking about who wrote the Bible and the writers of the Bible, part 6, then you remember the gentleman Johann Gottfried Eichhorn, who, as I said, was a scholar, respected scholar, and son of a pastor, which obviously gave him some leverage in the theological world. He cottoned onto this theory that the Bible, in fact, is written by two different people, two different stories, and it's been merged together. And he went so far as to divide the story into its two main sources. And one of the ways you can tell is that where somebody, a passage, verses, a group of verses, a chapter, whatever, uses the word Elohim for God, that's one source, and he called that E, obviously. And then where you see Yahweh being used as a word for God, that's the other source. And we'll see later on in these programs just who those sources were, but I don't want to bombard you with too much information at the moment. But that was called J, so in fact, it should be Y, of course, but the German Y is a J. Long story, but that's where it is, E and J. Okay? And so his idea was that the Bible was a combination. Two different works, two different people, that sort of thing. And I finished up last week by saying that theory lasted all of 18 years, which is not very long. But it was accepted theory for about 18 years. And then what happened, because he'd made the theory, of course, scholars start to look at the Bible in more detail. And scholars noted that within the E source, the people using Elohim, there were in fact two different sources. Since they both used Elohim as the name for God, it was assumed they were by the same author. But there were still those things called doublets I told you about, where the same thing is repeated again, slightly differently. And also, again, going into real detail, which I'm not going to bore you with, but there were differences in style, in languages, and in interests. You know, what they pushed to the forefront, shall we say? Much as the same way as the differences between E and J. Don't get too caught up in all these places, okay? So now what we have is a third source in E. And the way, why that's different and how they picked it out is it consists of a set of stories mostly about priests and priestly things, okay? It's about laws and rituals and sacrifice and incense burning and what's pure and not pure. And also a great concern, really pointed concern, for dates and numbers and measurements. And you see this coming out, okay? So this source came, not surprisingly enough, to be known as P. So J and E, the main sources, two different writers, writer J, writer E, and then writer E has some people called P who put stuff in there. I know, folks, it's a bit confusing, but bear with me, okay? So J, E, and P flow very easily through the first 4 books of the Bible. Okay, you can pick them out, you can see it. It's hard to do. I don't have a screen behind me, and I don't want to bore you with this, but I have a Bible at home, which it's not easily done, and it's not very cheap. But what it is the E source is in bold print, and the J source is in italics, and the P source is in bold italics, and it gets even more complicated. So you'll be reading 2 verses, and then it changes. This bit's from the other Bible, from the other source. Anyway, just remember two major sources put together. However, what there isn't in the 5th book, what's the 5th book? Deuteronomy. Okay, in the 5th book, there's not a trace of the J, E, and P interests. Not at all. Completely different. Okay, except maybe there is, I've got to put a caveat in the last chapter, there's a few lines that look like they came from one of the 2 main sources. Okay, Deuteronomy, and you probably know this yourself when you read Deuteronomy because it's totally different to the others, is written in an entirely different style. It has different vocabulary, different expressions, different phrases, and there are a huge amount of contradictions. It's one of the big problems when you start studying the Bible and you get to Deuteronomy and say, whoa, what's going on here? There's a great many contradictions between D and the other sources. Not just minor things, major contradictions. For example, one everybody probably knows about, the wording of the 10 Commandments is different. Okay, so there are others, and not enough time to go into all of them. But so now we have a 4th independent source called D, Deuteronomy D. Okay, now in itself, this discovery should not have caused a great crisis. We're talking about 17 something now. Okay, so the Bible's been around a while. I mean, after all, the New Testament's got 4 Gospels, and they're all different. All right, there's some things that are the same, but in each Gospel is different to the other. Some use some things from other Gospels, some don't, but they're all different. So why on earth, when Eichhorn brought this discovery out, or made this, put us in out, and then the other scholars started to add to it, why was there so much outrage about it? By Jews and Christians alike. The problem is, and we have that same sort of problem today, that it had been accepted for centuries, close to 2,000 years, it had been accepted that Moses wrote the first 5 books. That's end of the subject. Moses wrote the first 5 books, and probably a whole bunch of others too. Okay? So what the scholars were doing was getting into the face of old accepted traditions and accepted theological positions. Now, nobody wants to go and tell the pastor he's wrong. Nobody wants to tell the father that he's got it all wrong. Nobody wants to tell the high priest that he's got it all wrong. So that, and nobody in those positions wants people starting to discover from themselves of what they've learned for years and years and years, ever since they were in catechism or Sunday school or whatever young people in the Jewish religion go to, was wrong. Moses didn't write the first 5 books. May not have even written any of them. Okay? So no one knew where this would go. The church authorities, Jewish, Christian, whatever, were terrified. Where would this go? Is this going to destroy people's reliance on the Bible or trust in the Bible? I mean, maybe it wasn't written by Moses. What are we going to do now? The world's coming to an end. It was really quite a serious thing. I mean, do it this way. Imagine if you took 4 writers, 1, 2, 3, 4 writers, and told them, write a story about, here we go. Yesterday, or last night, here in Kentucky, or in Ohio actually, a bridge overpass fell down, right? You probably read it on the news, and killed a man and injured another one. Pretty horrific and pretty big news. It went all over it was on Good Morning America, so I guess it's good, big news. But anyway, it did. So you give 4 people and you tell them to write an account of that accident. Now you can write it from any viewpoint you want to, from the viewpoint of the truck driver, from the viewpoint of the city people who are responsible for that, from the viewpoint of the people who are actually doing the demolition, from the viewpoint of somebody who lives up on the hill, saw it happen, whatever. You write 4 stories. Then you take those 4 stories and you cut them up into paragraphs and you merge them all together like this. All right? So you've got one continuous account, which goes from the truck driver's position to the person on the hill, to the city councillor, to the demolition people, backwards and forwards, and you make it one continuous account. And you say, this was written by one person. Look at that, it's continuous, written by one person. That's not so far-fetched, but you can understand where I'm coming from. Now what you do is you go and get 5 detectives from your local precinct, and you tell them that this continuous narrative, which they've been looking at for a period of time, was actually written by 4 different people. And what you ask them to do is break out the 4 different sources by vocabulary, phrases, language used, not the handwriting, because it's all printed out, okay? By those sort of things, all right? And then you have to identify who they were. Okay, well, this bit's by the person who lived on the hill, that's the truck driver, that's that, okay? And then you have to say, okay, now who, excuse me, who combined these? Who's the person who put them all together? Imagine how difficult that would be. And then, when was it done? Now, multiply that by hundreds of years from the start to the finish. You see how difficult it is. I mean, they might use these detectives may say, well, we need something to go on. What's like that? So they may use the Noah's Ark story as an example. I mean, if you read, and there's your homework for this week, read the Noah's Ark story, complete all the way through. Okay, you will see it's obviously 2 different sources, one using Yahweh and one using Elohim. And it's very obvious. You have a verse where they said, and Yahweh said, and then 2 verses later, Elohim says something. 2 different sources, okay? And we can go look further of the animals, for example. One writer, one source, uses male and female to differentiate between the sexes. Take one male cow, one female cow, one male donkey, one female donkey, all right? The other source calls them man and woman, one man donkey, one woman donkey. Translated into English, all right? One source says that Noah took one pair of all the clean animals. The other source says that Noah took 7 pairs of clean and 1 pair of unclean. Obviously, you know that clean means animals for sacrifice. And you have Bible students who say, oh, well, that means he only took animals on board he could sacrifice. So what happened to the camels, which are not clean, and what happened to all the other animals that aren't suitable for sacrifice? We still got them. They would have drowned. I mean, sheep are clean, lions aren't. So sheep would have been on the ark, according to the first first source. Lions wouldn't. Second source, 7 examples of all the clean ones and 1 example of all the unclean ones. P, the priestly thing, is concerned with ages, how old everybody was, that sort of thing, dates, when it happened, and measurements. J is not. But the source from J, these are 2 sources I'm talking about, P and J, is not concerned about it at all. I mean, the P source, part of E, says they're in the ark for a year. And you can read the Bible and find that out. J says 40 days and 40 nights. P says Noah sent out a raven. J says a dove. And the really big difference, and this is one of these things that scholars have a field day with, and I'm probably going to get some reaction from behind the glass in there when I say it. The really big difference is the way God is depicted. J infers, in the passages from J, that God regrets things he has done. It says very clearly, God regretted what he had done. Okay? Which raises some interesting theological questions which we are not going to go into now. But it says it. Whereas the other source, P, God is this transcendent controller of the universe. Now, all of this, I've done this very quickly because I'm not a college professor and you are not students, not in that sense of the word. All of this is called the documentary hypothesis. Ask your professor if you're in college and you're doing religion or something. Ask your pastor. Catch your pastor on Sunday and ask him what the documentary hypothesis was. He'll thank me for it. I'm sure he will. Sometimes it's called higher criticism too, but you don't want to go there. And these theories and questions began to dominate Bible study in the late 18th and certainly most of the 19th century. Scholars began to look very closely at the traditions and the accepted practices about Bible study and reading the Bible. Well, if Moses didn't write it, that's fine. Well, who did? And why have we got 4 different sources? And why are they all so different? Okay? And they reached a consensus. All these, I can name names, but take half an hour to put all the names to them. They reached a consensus that at some point in all of this, there must have been a very skillful redactor. Now, that's a word you don't hear very much. So I'll get the Oxford Dictionary, and I use the Oxford Dictionary as opposed to Webster's for obvious reasons. But the Oxford Dictionary says a redactor, and I quote, is someone who puts text into appropriate form for publication. In other words, somebody who moves the text around and puts things in a better lineup so when you publish it, it looks right. And if you've never written a book, you probably wouldn't understand what I mean. But those of you who've submitted articles for publication, letters to the press, written short stories like I did when I was younger, know that publishers and editors switch it all around to make it run smoother than you thought. They even move characters around and things like that. They're called a redactor, okay? So now what we need to do, our task has got kind of more complicated, isn't it? We now need to find 4 writers, J, E, P, and D, and a redactor. Now, the argument is, well, maybe there was more than one, but no, that looking again at the Bible itself, it looks like it's done by one source. So we'll see. So who were they? I mean, when did they live? And what was their purpose? Why merge two separate sources or four separate sources? What would be the reason? I mean, we did the Gospels in the New Testament and didn't merge those. We kept them boom, 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 you know. So why? Did they know each other's work? Did the E priest know what the J priest, or whoever he was writing? Did they know the Deuteronomy chap? You know, did anyone know the redactor, or was he much later? Okay? And here's what's more important. Had any of them any idea that what they were writing would become the Bible? You with me? I mean, if these chaps were writing an account of their, as I said earlier, they're writing an account of the chap from Judah is writing an account of Judah's history from Judah's point of view, and the chap from Israel is writing the account from Israel's point of view. Did they think they were writing a book that here in 2,000 years we'd be sitting in a TV studio discussing it? Probably not. They were writing an account of what was happening then and there. And so the answer to all of these questions, really, funnily enough, is buried in the Bible pages itself. And some of it in the land of the Middle East. In other words, you know, archaeological discoveries and things like that. Okay? J and E, the main, if you like, the main histories, were written by two people who lived during the times that we went over earlier on and last week and the week before, the times of David and Solomon, this sort of thing, all right? Whoever wrote J, as I said before, appears to have been from Judah, because what he talks about is what's happening in Judah. The writer from E is from Israel, the 10 northern tribes, because he doesn't talk about Judah or Judah's kings. He talks about what's happening in Israel. Okay? And if you separate the E stories from the J stories, it's very clear that E was concerned with what was happening in Israel, and J is concerned with what's happening in Judah. It's not hard to do. Remember I was telling you about that Bible I have, which has it in different prints? When you get it like that, where it's pointed out to you, oh yeah, I see that. It's not easy to do on your own. I forget the name of the Bible, but you can probably look at it online. I'll remember it for next week. But and there's probably places online you can go that I haven't been to, which will do that, put it side by side so you compare it. Even the settings of the early stories reflect this bias. They started off their histories, these Bible writers, back in Genesis, both of them. But their stories about how things happen are different. The Yahweh stories in Genesis, eventually, no, not the very... Abraham is living in Hebron, which is the principal city of Judah. Okay? The capital, it was a capital under David before he moved it to Jerusalem. And we've all heard about Hebron. The high priest Zadok was from Hebron, by the way. That's a thing to think about for later on. And Yahweh, the J God, Yahweh, sets the kingdom boundary for the promised land from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates River, which coincidentally just happens to be the boundaries of King David's kingdom. Now, do you see where I'm going with this? When he was writing, God says, the boundaries of your country shall be from here to here. Oh, lo and behold, we're there already. Okay? In the Elohim stories, remember the story where Jacob fights with God or an angel, he's not quite sure which, and then he names the place Peniel, the face of God, which is the same name as the city built by Jeroboam in Israel. He talks about Shechem, the capital of Israel. Both sources make claims on Bethel, which was on the border between them. And both stories talk about Shechem, but they're very different. The E author has this convoluted story where a man from Shechem tries to marry Jacob's daughter, and then he rapes her, and they get real mad, and they have all the men in Shechem circumcise themselves, and while they're in pain and agony, the guys from Judah go and kill them. You know, pretty bad story how the E author gets, the Elohim crowd get Shechem. In J, the author says they're massacred. In J, the author says they massacred them. In E, it says they bought it. Now, you can't get two differently opposing things, all right? It just goes to show you that even a cursory glance at some of these stories will show you that they are written by two different points of view. And that's what gets so interesting, because you start to see that they're telling the same story but from two different viewpoints. The people, J, the Judah people, if you like, care nothing for the northern tribes, so of course they got Shechem by killing all the people in there because they offended their personal dignity. The E author, who's in country Shechem is in, says that they bought it. As I said earlier in the program, the Noah stories are quite different, Okay, even the size of the ark is different. So when you go over to the Answers in Genesis Museum, you might want to look closely at what they say over there, because whichever one you pick, you're not sure you're right, because there are two different versions of it. So we'll be back next week. We'll carry on with this, and not too much dry as dust detail, but you need to know some of the background as to why we get to the decisions we do get to. Okay. In the meantime, as I said, read your Noah's Ark story this week, and see if you can pick out the two different lines of thought. Maybe highlight the different verses that you think are one source and the other. That's what I do. Until then, read your Bible, whatever you do, and good night. God bless.